Today, Finn is going to give us a lecture on foreign aid and economic development insights from 40 plus years of research and academic work. Without further ado, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here. And when we were discussing what I should present, I mean, we were sort of discussing two possibilities. One was for me to try to give an overview of a very contentious debate and literature, where I have kind of, over the years, I've sort of tried to say, hey, wait a second, let's now try to look at the facts. Let's try to understand what's actually being done, what reflects a misunderstanding of economic methodology, and what we think we can say from an economics perspective. I recognize that there's much more in the world than economics, but that's sort of what I have been trying to contribute, hopefully, such that we can have a more balanced discussion. The other topic was about tracking rural households through structural transformation in Vietnam. I've been working for lots of years in Vietnam, and one of the most sort of exciting things I've been involved in is the longest panel of rural households in the world, and that was sort of another option. But maybe this sort of gives a bit more kind of an overview of bigger topics that I think deserve to be kept in mind. So what's my motivation? Well, it is basically to try to reflect on the effectiveness of foreign aid, drawing on personal experience and some of my academic work with a number of colleagues, including quite a big program that I was directing when I was at UNE Wider. I should say that I came to Swaziland for the first time as a relatively young man, 44 years ago. So it's almost 45 years. And what I try to and have done throughout my career is that I have spent, as Christian mentioned, extensive periods actually in developing country contexts. I mean, when I add it up, it's actually more than half of my work time. Why? Because I think it's essential. I mean, the sort of not engaging in the context of research can often lead to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. And then it has allowed me to follow my wife around the world. The only job I've ever taken, not following my wife, is the wider directorship. So that has been, personally, quite an interesting combination of how you optimize a couple's professional careers. But anyway, the topic I'm going to talk about, and I want to stress that, is this question of whether foreign aid boosts economic growth on average in developing countries or not. And that has its limitations. And I'll try to highlight some of those as we go along. And there are lots of issues that you face when you're trying to do that. At the same time, I do believe that there are some insights from the now more than 50 years of research that have accumulated, and I think that they deserve some attention. I should say that I have quite regularly been called an aid optimist. I've also been called a damn apologetic for foreign aid. And I'd like to sort of show that I don't quite think that fits. I think that's a little bit more straw tactics when you're getting into these tense debates, and I think that it's important that we keep facts straight. I'm going to start by speaking about sort of 4 experiences where I've been relatively close to the facts. The first one is Vietnam. Vietnam is a country that is moving very fast indeed. And we have, for more than a quarter century, we've seen some extremely high growth rates. And Vietnam has the world record in poverty reduction, as measured by the poverty rate. Why I've been involved in Vietnam, there's a long story about that. But what I can say, and what I think I'd like to keep reminding people, is that Vietnam was for a very long period of time the largest aid recipient in the world. Full stop, the largest in absolute terms. Of course, that is only part of the explanation behind Vietnam's development, but it has been an important part. And let's sort of talk just briefly about 3 concrete examples. I think it's pretty well recognized that physical infrastructure plays a key role in the development process. A very major share of the foreign resources that have entered Vietnam as foreign aid, and that goes both for the multilateral and the bilateral, has gone into infrastructure of all kinds of things. Anybody who sort of moved around in Vietnam will recognize that. So that's one example. A second example is quality control. This is something I know quite a bit about because my wife is a specialist in seed quality control, but I'm going to speak about something else right now, namely quality control of prawns and other fish products. It's pretty well recognized that good quality is absolutely essential for exporting these products, right? Trying to export to the EU is not easy. Actually, EU is pretty good at coming up with all kinds of strange rules and regulations. But because of very strict quality control, Vietnam exported for an amount of about $100 per person in 2014. That's sort of, well, that's kind of important, right? And why could they do it? Several reasons, but one important reason is the quality was guaranteed. I won't speak about the multiplier effects of all of this, but a third example is private sector development. The resources that have entered the country have been absolutely critical in relation to advice, credit, capital, etc. Anybody who looks at and studies the small and medium scale enterprise sector in Vietnam, as we have done, is struck by the fact that this has actually made sense. So in the case of Vietnam, yes, it has contributed. I am not saying that this is the only or even the major factor, but it's contributed. Let me now move to the second case, Mozambique, a country where my youngest son was born, next to Swaziland, where my older son was born, and a place which, of course, is very close to my heart. I arrived in 1980. The country was completely destroyed, and it was, in the subsequent years, destroyed even further. The American ambassador, who was certainly not a revolutionary, she once stated that this country was being ruined as a consequence of the Cold War and apartheid, and at the same time, about 1 million people were killed. Several 100,000 children, including also quite a number of colleagues, including 7 FAO colleagues that I had to pick up in the airport in their coffins. So there are things that went on which people have tended not to keep in mind when they have been discussing what then happened. I work very closely with somebody called Adriano Malan. He's now the prime minister. And what have we seen since then? We have seen things that we did not even dream about when rock bottom situation was reached in 1986. Peace did arrive. What I'm going to say now does not ignore the very issues up in the north now. But peace did arrive. And what did it contribute? Well, it contributed a massive humanitarian effort. It was part of ensuring that people simply survived. It was part of getting rid of 300,000 landmines that would not otherwise have been removed. That's one example. A second example is investment in education and health. When I arrived in Mozambique, there were 12 agronomists. This is now a number that can be multiplied by 100. Then I can mention similar data for lots of other areas. So investment in health and education, what economists sometimes refer to as human capital, it's a good investment. In addition to that, it also makes sense, of course, in its own right to do that. A third area is macroeconomic stability and the tax system. There's still a lot to be done. There's still a lot to be achieved in the area, but the system is being built up and therefore can gradually help get out of the aid dependency, which one also has to recognize is present in the country. I did not realize that in this period we are talking about from 86 to 92, that the GDP per capita actually increased from $250 per person to about 600, which is it's not some sort of small detail. It is actually a significant difference. Does that mean that everything is fine? That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying there was a difference that was made. Now to the African Economic Research Consortium. The 1980s have often been characterized as a lost decade in terms of development. And I've written on that extensively, and that was sort of very much part of my original macro work. And there are lots of reasons, including, of course, what we still tend to overlook very often, the colonial heritage, which go deep. One of these factors is economic policy. It's very clear that economic policy was not what one could have hoped for in parts of these years. It's also fair to say that conditions were imposed in ways that I can tell you quite a number of stories about. But ARC was started in 1988 with a view to trying to help fill this gap. So what have we seen? Well, we have seen very significantly increased macroeconomic management quality. We've seen that ARC has been a key actor in relation to actually getting quite a series of central bank governments to actually be much more influential in what we've seen since then. People like Bonn from Tanzania, who is one of the greatest economists you can think of. Balanced, intelligent. Unfortunately, his president insisted that he should participate in corona-infested meetings, so he died. There's an illustration of the fact that it's not always that the man in charge is the wisest. But Ben was a very wise man. But there's no question that this has played a key role in relation to the improved macroeconomic management that we do see in a number of African countries. ARC has been responsible for a massive capacity building program or training program. There are 16 African universities that are now part of this network and giving both courses and so on, which are starting to have an impact. I have myself been part of the process by being now chair of one of the thematic work groups on poverty, inequality, and labor market. A third example is we in Europe and the world more broadly, we of course like our networks, right? We like to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos, and we think it's important. Well, ARC is the possibility for African economists, development economists, to meet a network, to exchange, to help build and exchange experiences, discuss where they should position themselves, in parallel with doing all of the work on developing ideas as to how the future should be handled. And I can't help just sort of think about the difference between how African economies managed the global financial crisis in 2008 and what happened in previous decades. They managed that actually pretty well. The fourth case, I won't speak about Corona, but I mean, the similarities and so on are quite obvious. I mean, the fourth case is the Ebola crisis in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. I mean, it's obvious that this was a crisis where the efforts made in terms of mobilizing international action played a key role. It's very clear that it's not sufficient just to attack the immediate crisis. When crisis hits, well, that's just one example. You obviously have to think about what comes next. But it is important to recognize that health is a public good. And a public good often needs public money to be provided. The same goes for institution building, which will come afterwards. That often will not happen by itself. It does need public money to make that develop. So this was sort of my kind of introduction, if you wish. But these are actually examples which I have lived and worked. And I mean, it's not something that I just sort of kind of pulled out of some kind of textbook or whatever. So I do believe, and here you can say that I do have a belief. I do believe that the world has a moral duty to collaborate with poor people and countries. But that does go, for me, hand in hand with the fact that we have learned quite a bit about whether we can actually point to results from this effort, positive and negative. Of course, there are some people who have unrealistic expectations and therefore get disappointed. That's one thing. But one should also keep in mind that development is incredibly difficult. And not all projects, not all investment projects, as any private investor will know, will succeed. And it's simply, I mean, it's simply naive to argue that everything works 24 hours a day. I mean, it doesn't. The sort of question that remains is, okay, is there some sort of bottom line? And that's sort of what's in focus with the way in which I am kind of trying to address the issue that I will now sort of speak about when I'm talking about academic studies, and I've been part of some of them, and then there are others who have contributed very significantly as well. The early debate, I'll be relatively brief here, but the early debate from the 1970s and 1980s was very much influenced by some very simple cross-country growth regression work. Habeneck was publishing very important papers in the American Economic Review and so on. And that led to kind of somewhat unrealistic expectations. It was also influenced a lot by, okay, we were sort of using what is called the Harrod-Domer growth model. And the implicit assumption in that model doesn't stand up in reality. You assume that all the incoming flow is invested in and so on and so forth. And it can be a useful consistency model to kind of use for some small practical exercise. But if you actually want to try to understand whether it sort of gives you an estimate of actual impact of the flow, it doesn't really stand up. In addition to that, increasing disappointment, not only with traditional models, but also a lot of theory. There were arguments about Dutch disease. So if you provide aid to a country, will its exchange rate then appreciate and thereby undermine the effort from below? And a lot of it was sort of along the following lines of argument. I have two sons. You should not give your children too much money, pocket money, right? Because then moral hazard will set in and they will start misbehaving, etc., etc. A lot of these kinds of theories were put forward, but they were very often not tested. They were argued, but they were actually not tested empirically. And that has been one problem that has handicapped the literature, I would argue. A particular idea sneaked in, and this was that, and that's because we have a massive amount of project-level evidence, and I refer to some of them that seem to suggest that it works. But then the idea came in, oh, but it somehow evaporates as you move up to the macro level. Underlying reasons being, as I mentioned, Dutch disease is one, undermining institutions is another one. There are clearly arguments out there saying, oh, but I mean, this just completely undermines all the existing institutions. I'm going to speak a little bit about Angus Deaton in a little bit and try to give a rebuttal to his recent book. There were also some very influential overview articles which did not do independent research. They just kind of grabbed the tone of the idea and said, oh, we can say nothing. Particularly influenced by Paul Mosley, who did a study in which he said, oh, wow, yes, we can show it at the macro, but we can't show it at the macro. Sorry, we can show it at the micro, but we can't show it at the macro level, which is very much inherent in this so-called micro-macro paradox. when I got back to Copenhagen after my experiences in Mozambique, I was very naive. I just asked one simple question. I had to start teaching development economics. I said, I would like to know what the existing rigorous studies actually say. I mean, I had absolutely no clue what the result would be. But I just said, look, from these other things, I could see that they were just talking about the issue. They didn't present new, concrete evidence of their own findings. They spoke about it. So what did I do together with a colleague who looks likely to become the new head of department economics in Copenhagen, but leaving that aside, we started collecting all of the existing studies that had been done. It wasn't particularly easy, but we found 131. And what did they say? And let me just be very clear. I'm not defending the quality of these studies in their own right as such. I just wanted to know, what did they say? So several studies showed that aid was associated with decreased savings. And this is the idea that if you give money to somebody, then they start decreasing their own savings. However, the net was positive because the decrease in savings was smaller than the inflow. And there was only one study and one regression from a very, very early period that showed an impact that is greater than 8. I mean, that's almost like a statistical outlier, right? There was not a single study that said investment goes down. I'm not saying that all investment is having a positive impact, but there's a difference between saying that investment goes directly down as a consequence of the aid, and then saying, well, it's wasted money. There is a difference. And there's only one study and one regression, the Paul Mosley one, that shows a negative impact on growth. Paul has subsequently recognized that was a flawed study. I mean, there was simply technical problems in there. He's been very frank because he published himself this study that we put out. So based on this literature, I mean, one would have to say, well, based on what we know on rigorous studies, it seems to have some impact. Now, this was first stage. Together with quite a number of colleagues, I did sort of an inventory where we tried to sort of open up, this is not just about aid and growth, it's also about education, it's about health, it's about food system. And I mean, so there is a reference there that sort of try to substantiate this general finding. And then what happened? Well, suddenly the goalposts started moving. What was it? I can't go through this in detail here. But when we have more time in sort of our courses, when we point to the fact that there were new data, we suddenly started having data over time and across countries. So we had much better data than we had before. There was new growth theory that started addressing institutions. We started becoming much more aware that, hey, we need to be careful. If we give or assume that aid goes into a country, why do we do that? Because it's performing relatively poorly. And then when it starts improving, we pull out the Vietnam case. A lot of aid came in when Vietnam started doing better. We pull out. There were also new so-called econometric methods, so-called dynamic panels, that became very sort of favored too. Boone put out a paper in 1994 in European economy where it said aid is down the rat hole. That was the way the economists described it. That paper has since been demonstrated to have, I mean, simply incorrect econometric methods. But he faded for a very different reason. He faded because a couple of World Bank guys, I mean, one was an external professor and the other one was internal. They came out with this result. Aid works, but only in good policy countries. I mean, it had a lot of, there was lots of around it, I mean, it was almost too good to be true because it fitted completely with the Washington Consensus way of thinking about the world, which had sort of had not exactly a perfect performance in the 80s, but leaving that aside. What Donald and Burnside did was, I mean, it was smart. It was really, really smart. Because in some ways they cut the golden knot. They cut the micrometric paradox, saying, oh, we can, in the econometric analysis, we can introduce the so-called aid policy into action term. And when you do that, then they argued that, oh, then aid in itself no longer impacts on the growth, but the policy does. The aid policy into action term does, so aid works when policy is good. It was only significant at 10%, so strictly speaking, whether it should be kind of hammered so much as they did is but I mean, what happens here is, of course, that you can immediately sense an underlying development paradigm. And what is the key policy implication? Selectivity. You should allocate the aid based on whether countries have good policy or not. Where the heck does good policy come from? Good policy is endogenous. So you are saying that you need to allocate based on an endogenous characteristic. Hey, that's not how I'm thinking about development. That's not what my experience has shown me that we should try to do. We need to figure out how to improve policy. And that's what we're working on. A little bit like a teaser, you could actually have interpreted their results also by saying that policy works, but only in 8 receiving countries. But I mean, that would be academically an equally defensible statement. But there's a much better explanation, which Henrik and I came up with. We said, hey, wait a second. Let's try to look at the data and let's just see and keep a very standard insight from economics in mind. Diminishing returns, absorptive capacity. Actually, Burnside-Dollar made a major gaffe in their analysis. When they introduce an aid policy into action terms, they are obliged also to introduce aid squared and policy squared. That's standard insight from statistics. And when you do that, you know what happens? The aid policy into action term moves out to the aid squared. So in other words, the stronger explanation is that the reason why they got the result is because of absorptive capacity constraints, not because of the aid policy into action. I want to say very clearly, good policy is a good thing. I mean, I work on trying to help improve policies, so there's nothing in this that says they shouldn't strive for a good policy. But the Nigerian finance minister, he doesn't quite go to shelf number 77 and say, oh, that's the policy I want. And then he can implement that policy sort of by his free will. Policy is created due to professional academic insights, experience, but also due to political pressures and all kinds of things. Anyway, Burnside-Dollar continued to be influential for some time, but then gradually they were undermining that because donors really, in effect, didn't do it. I won't do this summing up, but there is one point here that I want to stress very clearly because I'm going to come to that now. When you have noisy data, a dirty dependent variable, dirty meaning that it's hard to measure it, and weak proxies, your results are biased towards zero. In other words, when things are very, very messy, you tend to get zero. And then what happened? The goalpost moves again. This time, not from the World Bank, but from the IMF. The research director in the IMF, we had turned the century. People were arguing that we should double A and so on. The IMF got nervous. Why did they get nervous? They said, oh, this is going to be creating lots of problems. You shouldn't give your children so much pocket money. Rajan did not know the aid literature, but he is a very intelligent informed economic analyst. He subsequently became the chief economist of India, but even that aside, and also central bank governor. They attacked it in a different way. They said, oh, we can't use the GMM methods that we have been using now because there are some econometric assumptions behind their use. So we should be more straightforward. We should use what's called long-run cross-section averages. This is to sort of simplify the underlying economic analysis. So in many ways, it was more a discussion about econometric methodology than anything. But they concluded, and that really attracted a lot of attention, oh, we can't find anything positive. I'm going to come back to this about what you can actually say a little bit later. But in a way, you can call it, oh, the return of the micro-macro paradox. It seems to work at the micro, and now I'm saying nothing is there at the macro. Why am I so tough in my statements around it now? Because I was in Vietnam in 2002 when he came to the largest aid recipient country in the world and put forward some very first thoughts in this paper. There was absolutely nothing but dust disease in it. It was just, it was a pure kind of not relating to the fact that he was in the world's largest aid recipient country that was doing really well. I became director of UNI in 2009. I had already before that built up contacts with Anita, sort of arguing that we should try to come up with a very comprehensive program that would, as I tried to formulate it, turn every stone in this. Because I was concerned about all these kind of conflicting, and I wanted to really just have a substantive body of literature. And lo and behold, we produced 247 original studies, including more than 300 researchers from 59 countries. And I should say that this is not a question of developed country. This is across the board. And this is summarized in 5 so-called position papers. So the first sort of step was to sort of say, okay, what is it that Rajana Subramanian did? And let's try to sort of think about it. Well, what do you do in empirics? I mean, the basic fundamental point of departure is that you want to falsify prior. That's sort of what we teach our students, that it's about falsifying priors. So what's the prior? My prior is approximately the same as Rajana Subramanian, that you, for 10% aid to GDP, you should get about a 1% increase in growth. That's a relatively standard, reasonably well-established. And across the board, you will find that that's sort of what we expect from our economic models. It's much below the Harrodonian. It's half maybe. The second insight is that the time dimension is important. I mean, if you save people's lives, then it looks as if aid doesn't work, measured by growth. It's important to keep that in mind. It takes time for education to work and give a return, and so on. And then a final point, which we wanted with this program, we really wanted to try to use all of the existing methodologies to try to see whether there was some kind of coherence or some kind of convergence among the results from the different lines of literature. So it's not just about one specific cross-country type approach. I won't go into this, but I mean, I do want to say that the improvements in Rajana Subramanian's work on instrumentation, on growth equation specification, and on the control estimator, they are very standard. I mean, these are things we teach students in their second year. And we did these improvements, and what happened? The result that they had claimed was statistically insignificant. It's about the same size impact, but it turns statistically significant. Try to just think about it for a second. When you, in your economic analysis, arrive at an insignificant result, then you're supposed to say, I don't know. You're not supposed to say, you have now shown that there's no impact. But when you get the statistical significance, that's where you can start being a little bit more assured. Basically, it's impossible to reject the theoretical prior once you do these very simple improvements in the analysis. So back to no, there is no macro paradox. There are problems in A. A doesn't work as we would want it to. There are all kinds of problems. And I'm not very popular in them either, because I do point out when I meet things that are absolutely not coming full. I have for years been having a very, very good colleague called Katarina Eusebius. Her husband is also a leading time series in nutrition. He's the closest to Denmark in economics has ever been with a Nobel Prize, but leaving that aside. I have been trying to get Katarina to engage because she's really, really a strong time series in nutrition. So now we're sort of moving in the use of different methodologies, right? But she's saying, no, wait. I mean, this goes back to the early 90s. It's too early. The databases are not ready. But then finally, around 2012-13, she said, okay, now we can start doing time series econometrics now. And she was also getting quite upset by this misuse of statistical insignificance as an argument for ineffectiveness. Because it simply provoked her as what is fundamentally an econometrician at heart, right? I don't see myself as an econometrician at heart. I see myself as a development economist at heart that uses these methodologies in order to learn. So we did a comprehensive analysis based on the so-called VAR model, and it showed up very clearly that in 33, there was absolutely no discussion. There were 3 countries where it was a bit more tricky, but it was very clear. The relationship between the key macro variables and the aid inflows was basically positive across 33 countries. The 3, you can guess about who they are. One was the Comoros, and the other 2 were Ghana and Tanzania. Ghana and Tanzania are interesting because they've seen some rather massive breaks, structural breaks in the data series, which make them more difficult to analyze. So when we went back to the drawing board afterwards, the basic result for Ghana and Tanzania remain the same as the other. However, what's very, very important, which flies straight in the face of these simplistic generalization, is that the transmission of aid to macroeconomy is very, very heterogeneous. In other words, don't try to generalize too simplistically. What I've been speaking about is sort of the first order question. Does aid work? Should we close the business? Should we give it up? It seems that that message is kind of what at least some countries are doing these days. But that's what's lying behind asking this bigger question. It has been used like that. I mean, there are colleagues who've gone out and said, look, oh, the literature seems to suggest that there's no impact, so close it, stop it. So there is, of course, another question, which is, what should we give aid for as a donor? Trying to open up the black box. I've always been very, very hesitant to take that further step, because that is very, very dependent on specific country circumstances and so on. But we did have a go at it. And we made a series of counterfactual calculations where if you have a baseline and then you try to increase the aid by $25 per capita per year, and then these are the results that come out of sort of relatively standard economic modeling. So you get an increase in growth, the headcount in poverty goes down, agriculture falls. Why? Well, because the relative size of agriculture in a process of development goes down. The relative, not the absolute. Investment goes up, schooling and life expectancy goes up. So it is actually possible with these simulation models to get a story that's coherent with both the simplicity cross-country, the time series, and so on. Then the goalpost moved again. Another in-house fight among economists, because some now started to use meta-analysis. So what is meta-analysis? Well, basically, Disaggregating and Paldam, and to some extent seconded by Drea from this country, they started saying, oh, if we try to do meta-analysis, then it seems not to be working. They compiled 68 studies, and then they reached the conclusion, oh, we can't find anything. Meta-analysis is very much used in medical sciences for good reasons. Why? Because you can control medical tests. The test done in Australia is pretty much the same as the one done in Zimbabwe, as the one done in Denmark, by and large, right? So there you can kind of defend. And the main idea is to basically pool lots of different studies and the results, and then get a single impact estimate. But there is something quite important looming in the background here. And that is that you can either allow or ignore heterogeneity between the studies. And that's absolutely fundamental. You either allow for or ignore heterogeneity among the studies. When you look at the aid literature, you have studies from very few countries to studies on a lot of countries and so on. Now, if you ignore heterogeneity, then you use the so-called mixed effects model. So what do you then postulate? Well, you postulate that all studies, they estimate the same parameter, the same true effect, so-called. But, so any variation is just due to sampling. Essentially what it is that it's just saying that an apple and an orange is exactly the same thing. I kind of would argue that you should allow for heterogeneity, and then you should use a so-called random effect model, where you basically say, yes, each paper tries to do the best to establish its true effect, but this effect will vary across studies. So you split up the variables. Okay, I'll not get into this theoretical reasons why the fixed effect model is simply misplaced. But with Sedate, we checked, and it was obvious that you should use a random effect. It's just no question about it. And when you control for that heterogeneity, you know what happens? You get pretty much the same results as you get from the whole previous study. Whole previous study get pretty much the same. So, what I would say is that maybe it's now time to say, okay, what could we then say based on the accumulated evidence in these various studies that have been published in a range of journals? So then, together with Channing and Sam, we essentially went in and said, okay, can we somehow validate the existing literature through a series of simulations? So basically trying to use a standard economic model. Can we show that this body of literature that we had at that time falls within what this would project? And could we, that was an added on objective, could we somehow come up with an estimate of what has been the return as an overall exercise? Now, this is the full body of literature that had been, that was available at this point in time, and here we're talking about 2017. And you will note that there are only two minuses. I'll comment on these two minuses in just a second. There are, of course, some which are insignificant, but the question was, would our simulation model generate results like this? And it did. The two minuses, what is the problem with the two minuses? Well, the first one, where Drea is one of the co-authors, they did time series econometrics on databases where a number of countries have one observation. That's simply not allowed. I mean, you can. I mean, you can use an analytical tool that's a time series analytical tool when there's only one observation. I mean, it goes wrong. The second one estimates in the analysis control for investment. In other words, it basically blocks the impact of the aid on the growth rate through investment. Now that's like saying, oh, but one of the important challenges, you basically just put it on. So I should say that there is one further study that has come afterwards. It says something about that new evidence using an excluder instrument. This paper was already out in 2015 and was not accepted for a number of reasons. That would be very technical to explain. But here, highlighting these insights, you basically get that it's very, very important to look over the long run. And it's very important to look at a variety of channels through impacts. So this is not just a question of physical infrastructure. This is not just a question of human capital. It's also a question of institutions. But when we do these exercises, we come up with an estimate of around 15% as the internal rate of return. The old cutoff for World Bank projects was 10%. So this is, after all, somewhat interesting. Now, the last piece that I'm going to, and this is just pushing through. So then Angus Deaton gets his Nobel Prize, and he starts making statements about things he doesn't know too much about. Something that Nobel Prize takers sometimes do. He wrote a book, and he praised all of the good things that have happened in Africa in terms of education, in terms of health. And then he went on and said, oh, but by the way, aid does not seem to work. It seems to be undermining institutions. What's the main argument in his book for that? Which is in glaring contrast with the first part. It is that there were two studies that he thought were important. Which two studies? Dollar and Burnside and Mozambique. They are the two econometric studies that motivate him to say that the whole exercise is useless. That provoked Sam and I to sort of say, okay, let's now try and see whether we can somehow come up with a study on what's actually the impact of aid on institutions. So we went through the whole drill. We got the project's aid database. We disaggregated, we used this disaggregated database and used various metrics of political institutions, and then did both the long run cross-section. We were not going to be exposed to criticism on that score. And when we do that, we find a small positive impact. Not a big thing, but a small positive impact. And that the main inflow that seemed to work was a stable inflow of government aid. A stable inflow. Not fluctuating, not fragmented, and all these things. But a stable inflow does, over longer periods of time, seem to have an impact. We concluded, and that's now out in the JDE, that there is no kind of strong data in this regard to support that there's a systematic negative. Does that mean that there are not countries where it's negative? I have said that there are negative impacts in Mozambique. I'm on record of saying that, and I can explain that. But the general view is that you cannot argue as Deaton did. The long time frames is something that I really think is very, very important to keep in mind. They are necessary in order to detect the impact. First of all, because the aid inflow is, after all, not that big. I mean, when you start calculating aid per capita in the aid recipient countries, I mean, it's not that big, quite frankly. And then there are those lags that I mentioned in terms of it takes time for education to have a productive impact or contribution. It's also complicated because growth has been fluctuating a lot. And I mean, it's characteristic for all of the countries that we're talking about here. And I mean, there are still data issues that imply, and remember that I said something about that when you have data that are not up to it and so on, there is a so-called iron law of econometrics that then things tend to be converging towards zero. So it's not really surprising, I think, that in the economics profession has sort of kind of only recently. And I should say that the presentation that I've given here today in terms of where the literature is, in terms of the fundamental critique of especially Burnside-Dollar and Brother Schumann, has not been challenged. Not at all. There's no single study to show that our rebuttal to these two studies is wrong. We have made the data available. They've been going through all kinds of replication exercises, etc. Nobody has shown that these rebuttals are not correct. What does surprise me as an academic is why statistically insignificant results have been used so extensively in the literature as proof of absence of impact instead of absence of evidence. That's a puzzle. And that I cannot, as a development economist, as an academic development economist, I tend to hesitate from suggesting that I have an answer to. If I sort of move a little bit out of that kind of, then I might come up with a few hypotheses about it. But that's where we are. Thinking more constructively, I mean, one of the things we did do was that we tried to come up with a summary of what we call aid in a post-2015 world. And also there is a statement which came out among sort of 13 leading development economists about sort of how one would formulate some principles for policy making, but I'll leave that aside. But there's something I want to say in the conclusion that I try to address a particular literature and try to get facts straight. I actually don't have particularly a mission to say that aid works. I mean, that's not what but I want to have the facts straight, because only when I have the facts straight can I go out and try to pursue all of the tasks that we are doing when we're discussing with governments, what should be done better, what should be dropped, and so on and so forth. Only when you have that reference point is it that I somehow feel justified in what I'm trying to do. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your attention.